We're really excited to have two panelists talk about how much fun it is to feed and care for a glass house, and what to look for and what not to look for when you're thinking about acquiring a glass house or getting rid of a glass house. I'm going to introduce the panel, and then they'll go through a slideshow, and then we'll have time for Q&A following. And again, I'll do the story if you need the credits. Use your QR code or sign a piece of paper. Our panelists, it's a really hands-on living Goodman discussion. Sort of in our neighborhood, how to take a sexy magazine set piece and make it livable through 4 seasons, not just the shoulder seasons. Particularly with large expanses of glass window walls. Where does it make sense to invest your time and resources, and what can remain what we call at our house the quirky ambience of our Hollin HIlls house? Michael Shapiro is here to talk about this, as well as Robert Fina. Michael discovered Goodman and other mid-century modern neighborhoods in about 2005. Some of you are probably familiar with his blog. He and his wife had lived in Arlington in a 1939 townhouse and then moved to Florida before coming back to DC. And for their next step, they wanted something contemporary. He was not interested in colonials or more traditional designs, but didn't know anything about mid-century. And I shared with Michael the story of Jim and myself moving here and telling our realtor we did not want a center hall colonial, nor did we want a house on a street with a double yellow line. There is no house available in the Virginia market that doesn't meet those two. Farmhouses are on the main streets, they have double yellow line, and everything else was center hall colonials. So she didn't fire us, but came close. Michael was never really interested in the colonials or more traditional designs in the area, but did not know anything about mid-century modern. He was always drawn to good design as a kid, from Porsches to Air Jordans to watches. Although he has no formal training, his degree is in journalism and political science. He started the Modern Capital blog, which most all of you, if not all of you, read. And then had so many people excited about his readings, he decided to become a realtor, and now he sells mid-century houses. Robert Fina, who grew up in Hollin HIlls, has owned and operated a construction company focused on Hollin HIlls. You heard last night Mary Means bemoan the fact that Robert didn't have a passport to cross the river. And then you heard people this morning talk about, well, if only Bob or Robert Fina could take care of this for us. So well known for solving quirky problems in Hollin HIlls houses. I think he's even pictured in some of those early black and white photos in the Hollin HIlls Visions book when you were a little shorter. Robert chose to return as an adult and took on roles as diverse as the Civic Association's social chair. I do remember.
Yay!
And most recently, he did all the trails in our parks when we restored the parks. So he's an integral part of the community as well as a fixer for the community. So with that, I'm going to let these gentlemen share the slides, and then we'll have Q&A.
Thanks. Thanks for the intro. Before I start, I know Joey Lample's here. I just want to thank her for, as Elisabeth said, as I started reading and didn't know anything about this, I read her submission for the Maryland neighborhood, so I want to shout her out and the knowledge that I learned with a lot from what she wrote. So that's a really great resource. Thanks. So the way I set this up is really about, talking about if a client is coming to me to buy a Goodman, and it's been now since 2008, so it's been a long time. Really the process or the discussion that I have with them. A lot of them have been first-time home buyers, never owned a home before, maybe we're renting. So really walking through, especially with a Goodman, the things that you really have to think about in terms of maintenance, in terms of what to look for, in terms of where your costs are going to be, and just things for comfort, livability, and so forth. So the way I set up is really walking through all that, all the different things that I talk to my clients about, and then obviously once they buy the house, they'll determine what they want to do, and then call people like Robert and others that specialize in them. So that's not my specialty, but it's really about educating buyers, again, mostly who've never owned a Goodman or a mid-century modern home, and just what is really needed to be thought through, and really the keys to focus on. So that's kind of how I set it up. That's actually a house in Hollin HIlls. So this house is actually in Maryland. on Lloyd Road. That was a little strip that Goodman actually designed, that was sort of like a one road, I think it's like a one road neighborhood essentially that Goodman designed, and then he built some of the houses there. So that's just a one in the woods there. But basically what I talk to people, and you guys know these things, is really the ethos of Goodman in terms of being very simple, prefab, not very robust in a sense. I mean, it's mostly glass. And what I've seen, in doing this now 15, 16 years, is that there are later mid-century modern homes that I would say are a little bit more robust, I would say that are built in general. I'm thinking of like the Deegert and Yerkes homes in Wessington, much more, I would say, solid, a lot more brick, less glass. So those are things that, you see in the earlier Goodmans in the 50s from the neighborhoods in Maryland to obviously the early ones in Hollin HIlls. Just obviously very simple, delicate, mostly glass, and built into the environment. I mean, I'm from New York, I'm from Brooklyn, and I always like refer to Levittown, on Long Island, where basically, obviously, the island's flat, and they just whatever, any tree, everything was just mowed down, and it's just like one house next to each other, the typical one after another suburbia, right? But that's not obviously what Goodman did. He built it into the landscape, and they kept it with East and Cross, and how they sited every house, obviously. So that's a key factor to look at in terms of how it's sited, the impact of water, the impact of the terrain, which is, you're gonna have a bigger impact if you're just on this, flat surface, one house after another. So that's really the sort of the overarching view that I give people, is that these are things that you really have to think about when you're looking to buy a Goodman, especially a Goodman, and other mid-centuries in our area, but definitely Goodman because of how they sited them and where they're really situated. So that's sort of the overarching kind of message that I give people. And these are, then I go into the key maintenance items. This is a house that needed a lot of maintenance, as you could see. This was a house I was trying to sell for someone in Hammond Wood, elderly man. It was there 50 years, actually an architect, and unfortunately they foreclosed on him, so we couldn't save that. People bought and renovated in a very offensive way, I would say. That's my critical view. I just can't even. But and I tried for 3 years to find someone to save it in the sense of renovating in a sensitive way, and the people that bought it didn't, unfortunately. But really, these are the key items that I walk through with people. Obviously, the windows, single pane glass. The chimneys, obviously, in the Goodmans, they're huge in terms of stature and focus of the design. Trees, obviously, like I said before, they're built into areas that are heavily treed now. I guess Hollin HIlls, I've seen the old pictures, I guess it wasn't as heavily treed as I originally thought it was, because you see the pictures, it's pretty bare, right? So
it was farmland.
Yeah, exactly. But they still built it into the land. They didn't bulldoze the land, make it flat. Obviously, you have all the hills, and it's called Hollin HIlls. So obviously, the trees and the environment. Water management, which I said before. Ductwork and floors. That's mostly with the early single families that I see. I've had clients where there's basically water in the ductwork, so that's something obviously to work out for. You don't want that. Flat roofs. Obviously, if it's a flat roof, our environment here is not the best for flat roofs, and dealing with snow, although we don't have that much anymore. But just the environment here, it's not California, it's not Las Vegas, it's not Phoenix. So obviously that is something to look into to see if is it a flat roof? Do you want a flat roof? I'm listing actually a house in Bethesda, just new, by Hugh Jacobson, one of his earliest houses, and it really done in his international style. And this massive big flat roof. That's probably has to be redone. The cost, a lot of architects in the room, and Robert, to do that, I don't know how much that's gonna cost. So that's something that I'll have to deal with and try to sell it. So that, something to think about. And then the big one, obviously, is, we were talking with Sean before about restrictions on changes. What does the neighborhood you're buying into, does it have restrictions or not? Obviously, Hollin HIlls has many more restrictions now. It had architectural review and now the historic overlay. I live in Bethesda, so some of the the Maryland neighborhoods I work with do not have that. They're on the National Register of Historic Places, but there are really no protections or ways to prevent that. Luckily, I would say in those neighborhoods they have been largely kept intact, even though the interiors might be ruined, I think. But the homes have been typically kept, which is good. But there's no real anyone can knock them down. So those are really the key kind of focuses. I'll walk through them a little bit. Obviously the windows, obviously single pane glass. I mean, I love the look of it. I do not live in a Goodman, so I go into them and I say, oh, the single pane glass is really cool. They're beautiful. The lines are perfect, and that's the beauty of Goodman. But do you want to live in that during the winter? Many people don't. But I tell people, if you're buying it, live with it for a year. Really see how you feel during the different changes in the season. See how you feel. I mean, obviously people were living in these homes for 50 or 60 years. They never changed the glass. So, for whatever reason, in terms of costs, or they just they were comfortable, didn't mind. So I always tell people to really go through a season and really see how you feel before making that decision. Obviously talking about comfort level, cost. I've had clients, friends of mine that bought a house in Hammond Wood, and the first thing they did was do the windows because they were concerned about using more energy and things like that. They're very concerned about the environment. And then obviously restrictions, like hickory cluster, obviously you have to use certain types of windows on that. So again, what is the neighborhood restriction? Interesting, something about the cost and comfort level. I had clients that were both architects, husband and wife architects. They bought in Hammond, in Rock Creek Woods, on Goodman's there. They bought it was an estate sale, needed a lot of work. Bought it, renovated. They renovated the kitchen, renovated the bathrooms, beautiful modern, interior. And then a few years later, the wife is now like the dean of architecture at Georgia Tech, Julie Kim. And so they moved, so they asked me to sell the house. And when I went in there, obviously it was a beautiful redesign, but they didn't do the windows. All the windows were original glass. And I asked them, I said, you guys are architects, like, why wouldn't you do the windows? It's like, you could get the glass at, cheaper cost, and like, why wouldn't you do that? And even, they even said that, they basically that they would never get back to cost in doing that. Now, again, they were only there for a couple of years, so, but obviously if you're gonna be there a long time, and it's a comfort thing, and you're cold, and you're gonna do those, and most people do them, but here they're architects, and they didn't actually touch it because the cost-benefit analysis for them wasn't worth it. And again, they did that without even knowing that they were going to be there. So it's it's obviously a very personal choice on that. So that's what the windows. Chimney, obviously it's a major architectural feature. This is one in Hammond Wood that listed recently and sold. Obviously the centerpiece of the living room. I don't know. This obviously most older homes you see the leaks, but obviously it's such a big focus of the living room that you notice it. So it's something to really look at. Obviously a lot of deterioration you see. I don't know if it's, I guess Goodman used the recycled bricks from Baltimore, right? And so I don't know if that has any impact or not for those old factories. But that's obviously something that I talk to people about, something to look at, something to spend money on typically, is that it hasn't been used, not looked after, and they're again a massive feature within the house. So that's something to obviously look at. Trees. This is most people don't think about when they're buying a home, but they in the Goodman neighborhoods obviously have an impact. This is just an example. This is a house that Michael Cook and I bought a number of years ago. It was a single, one-off Goodman in Laconia, and you can see the trees were not maintained in that top picture. And then we redid it and sold it. But again, heavily wooded, older established neighborhoods, you have to factor in and take that into account when you're buying a house. A lot of times you'll do a lot of tree work and clients will say, oh, I spent $15,000, $20,000 on tree work, and they want to get that back, and it's very difficult as a realtor to, we say that, but to really get that money back is very difficult. I've had people spend tens of thousands outside, just never get that money back. So it's obviously something to really focus on in terms of, when you're looking to do exterior projects like that, or trees. It has to be done, but it's hard to get that dollar for dollar back in a lot of ways, from what I've seen, and obviously budget for that. Water. Actually, this is the house that I mentioned with the architects that didn't do the glass there, so that's the original glass still. Again, the water, like Rock Creek Woods, Hollin HIlls, built into the hills and natural landscape. It's not leveled, and again, it's not Levittown, my Long Island reference. And really keep an eye on the below grade walls. One of my earliest listings in Rock Creek Woods, basically the lower level wall that was built into the hill, so that below grade wall was essentially, and again, I'm not an architect, but it was bowing, like that whole wall. And it had a really material impact on what my sellers were able to sell that house for. We had to basically give a lot of money off that price because of that whole wall was bowing. So that's something to really keep in mind in terms of that work. One level homes, this is HVAC. Again, really most of it the one levels. The duct work, again, this house I actually listed, this is in Wheaton Crest, so there's like a couple dozen little one levels. And basically, the guys had to go to mini splits because basically every time it rained, or not every time, but when there was heavy rain, they would have water seeping up into that ductwork. So they abandoned that, I guess filled it in or closed it off, I don't remember, and they went to mini splits. So, if I'm talking to clients looking for a Goodman that especially has, one level, I raise that because I've seen that before, and that's obviously a monetary issue and a comfort issue.
What's a mini split?
Do you want to ask?
It's a small heat pump that generally just serves 1 or 2 rooms at a time instead of the whole house.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So they did that in the different bedrooms and in the living room, but that's something to keep in mind. Again, not only for Goodman, but I've seen it in other mid-centuries like this. Humul Jacobs, I'm listing that lower level, it's basically deteriorated, and those ductworks are basically shot. So it's something to keep in mind. Here's a picture from Hickory Cluster. Obviously the flat roofs are an issue, mostly in Hollin HIlls there's some, and obviously Hickory Cluster. Most of the other neighborhoods really don't have flat roofs, so it's mostly there. Also in terms of materials, tar and gravel, I've seen still some still have tar and gravel, but a lot of that has gone. So the question of no one's really doing that, right? So do you replace it with that? Do you want to make it exactly the way it was? Replace it? Again, that's a maintenance, a cost item. Obviously, people are moving to the membranes, which are not necessarily cheap. And again, does the community maintain it? Like River Park, the Goodman's there in Southwest, so that is handled by the community. It's a co-op, so that's part of your fees. They do the roof, so like you don't, as a Goodman owner there, you don't have to spend the money or focus on that. They have to pay for that. So does the community maintain? And then again, restrictions, are there any restrictions on what kind of materials, what type of roof you can do? And then really the last thing is the restrictions. Are there restrictions? Some Goodman neighborhoods have the architectural review and the overlay like Hollin HIlls, but really most don't. Hickory Cluster has HOA there, so there are the review there, and obviously in River Park there's the co-op. But in all the other Goodman neighborhoods, mostly talking about in Maryland, Hammond Wood, Rock Creek Woods, Wheaton Crest, Holland Ridge, they do not. So there are no restrictions on what someone can do with the property, and that's when you're making changes, exterior changes, obviously that's a big factor in what you can do, what you want to do, what you're allowed to do. So I just always walk that through with clients about what is allowed, what's not allowed. And that's really the main sort of things that I walk through. Again, mostly focusing on clients that are buying one of these for the first time. What are the things you need to think about?
Great,
Well done.
Thanks.
thank you.
Thanks. Now we have the solutions from Robert. I just raised the problem.
So I think you picked up most of the issues, so I'm going to try to talk about it a little bit. So I've been in Hollin HIlls a long time, and most of my focus at work has been in Hollin HIlls, but as you saw from Michael's pictures, the houses are very similar. So the issues are transportable. So this is me when I was 4. In Hollin HIlls, this is my parents. They bought the first house in New Hollin HIlls, which is the sort of flat level area. And it was before the roads were paved. Their moving van had to be towed through the mud by a bulldozer to get to the house. We make the picture go. So basically in Hollin Hills, there's two general models of house, although there's many, many different models. There's the sloped roof house and there's the flat roof houses. So I'm dividing it up, and a lot of them have similar problems, but here's where they are. The roof, insulation, gutters, windows, and let's go to the next slide. And then, again, trees that Michael talked about, venting, we'll talk a little bit about that. Siding, glass and trim, the fireplace, brick, and all the stuff that's underground. The water lines, the sewer lines, ductwork, marine clay, and electrical service, which has increasingly been buried.
Pretty much everything.
All right, let's go to the next one. So, Michael talked about, thinking about trees when you're buying a house. Well, this is what happens when you don't think about it. And this is a perfectly healthy tree blew over in a storm and crushed part of the house. Moving on. So roof types. So there's the sloped roofs and there's the flat roofs. And all the houses originally had this gravel roof, which is called tar and gravel, or slag, or built up. Basically, it's layers of tar paper, and then gravel on the top to act as a sun reflector and as ballast to help hold the roof down and keep it from blowing away, the roof membrane. More recently are these membrane roofs, rubber membrane. This is EPDM, which is black, and you can see flat roof, there's a puddle on the roof, and because the roof structure is basically undersized over time, it's sagged, so the water accumulates on the roof and doesn't get to the drains or to the edge, which can add, and I think was intentional because it adds some thermal mass and protects the roof with some water on it. But if you get a leak in that membrane, it just keeps leaking until all the water is in your living room and not on the roof anymore. So that's problematic. A lot of the sloped roofs have gone to shingles. The pitch of the roof is just steep enough that you can install a shingle roof. And a lot of people have done that because it's much, much less expensive than the other alternatives. And the last roofing material that we're seeing a lot of now is TPO. It's a rubber membrane. And it doesn't look great, particularly if you can see it from ground level, but it has the advantage of being super clean, incredibly easy to repair, reflects sunlight, so it reduces your heating load in the summer, and it's easy to maintain. You can go up there with a leaf blower and blow everything off or sweep it off. The problem with the gravel roof is if you get a hole in the roof, you have no idea where it is, or you don't have a great idea where it is. You can scrape all the gravel off first, which is embedded in the tar, to figure out where the leak is, and then you've got to fix it. So that's the hardest part. So next. So this is a close-up of the slag or built-up roof, and you can see the layers of tar paper. And what happens over time is that the UV radiation in the sunlight degrades the tar, it dries out, it cracks, disappears, and then the water starts getting in. So that's how the leaks start. And over time, the gravel, which is embedded in the tar, washes off. And depending on how good a job the roofer did, putting the gravel down, sometimes a lot of it washes off, and sometimes it's not a problem. But this is an older roof. This is probably 20 or 30 years old. The roofs, the sloped roofs, used to last about 30 years or so, but as the quality of the material has continued to decline, 20 years is pretty long now for a slag roof. So this is typical older roof, and the moss builds up on it because this is perfect moss habitat. It's moist, it can get its little feeders down there. So a lot of people think this is a problem, like, oh, the roots are gonna grow into the roof and destroy it. My take is that the moss is a good thing. It helps hold the gravel in place. It is another layer of sunscreen for the roof. Remember, the thing that kills the roof is the sun. And it's a little bit more insulation, and it's a green roof, right? So it holds a little moisture. This is a typical chimney. The chimney mass in Hollin Hills and a lot of Goodman houses is big because it was a structural element to anchor the house, to keep it from moving sideways because there are no walls, it's just glass. So when the wind blows, without that big chimney mast, there's the chance the house might shift a little bit and break windows. So the chimney is important from a structural standpoint. And this is sort of the typical problem, is that the flashing is glued to the brick with tar, and it peels away over time, and then the water just runs down between the flashing and the brick, and what's below that is basically your living room ceiling. So a typical problem is that the chimney brick below, and I should have brought a picture of that, is all stained and has water problems. And then this is the typical cap. Originally the caps were just masonry, and then people started putting tar on them to try and make them a little more waterproof. This is the gutter system. So this is the famous Hollin HIlls box gutter. It's a square as opposed to the kind of SOG shape. The problem with this is it's custom made. It's made in 8 or 10 foot sections, and each section has to be sealed together to become waterproof, and that doesn't really last very long. So and the original gutters were steel, galvanized steel, so it would start rusting out over time. The water would start leaking through the bottom. Then the other problem is all this gravel washes down and fills up the gutter. And then when it rains, the gutter's full of gravel, so the water goes over the gutter and down the side of the house or on the ground. So those are sort of typical roof problems. Let's move on. So under that roof, and this is the attic or attic crawl space of the typical pitched roof house that is in the upper part of the neighborhood. So these are trusses that were built on site at a shop that is where the pool is now, and they were bolted together at that shop, and then the trusses were brought up here. And the problem is, as you can see in this picture, the trusses were undersized for the span, so they sag. So every Hollin HIlls house, if you look at it, of this model, you can see that belly in the roof. It's not like this, it's like that. And these intermediate chords of the truss, you can see they're scabbed together with pieces of leftover flooring or siding. So it's not like a modern truss that's actually pretty solid. These are just not so great. But none of them have collapsed yet that I know of.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another issue with the attics is the insulation. So the original insulation was this, tin foil. So a layer of tin foil on top of the ceiling that was supposed to be a vapor barrier, a reflective heat barrier, and probably had some insulating value, but not great. So what has happened over time, people have come in and blown in cellulose, which is great, or they put in fiberglass. Here's a little piece of fiberglass. The problem is the eaves all have holes for venting, little soffit holes, so that the air can vent through the attic so the moisture doesn't build up. But the unskilled or unaware insulation contractor just blows the insulation up there, and it blocks all of those vents. We did one attic, or redid one attic for a Hollin HIlls client, where the contractor basically came in and just blew this entire void filled with this cellulose insulation. And so there was no ventilation, and all the moisture from the inside of the house, from showering, the humidifier, breathing, cooking, just collected in this giant sponge in the attic and just started being mildewy and disgusting. And basically we had to come in and dig it all out and start over. So a little attention is required. So the insulation is often an issue. And then as you can see, there's all sorts of other stuff up here. Electrical wiring just run everywhere. This is a gas pipe. This is a recessed light. I don't know what that is. So there's all sorts of stuff up there that some of it's abandoned, some of it's being used. Here's some water pipes. Actually, that's probably the air conditioning condensate. But we've also seen attics where the water pipes, like for the addition, just run through the attic. And so when it gets really cold, the water pipes freeze and burst, and then you've got this rain out of the ceiling. So a little care is necessary. All right, let's move on. So here's some more attic or roof photos. This is in the older part of Hollin Hills when they were still using real plaster instead of drywall. So the plaster board came in 2-foot squares, and that was nailed up to the ceiling with smooth shank nails, and then the plaster came in and smoothed over another 1/2 inch or 3/4 of an inch of plaster. Over time, the weight pulls the nails out, and this whole section of ceiling collapsed onto their master bed. Luckily, they were not home when that happened, or it would have been a rude awakening. And so we fixed that in numerous houses, but it's a big problem. Then you can also see there's ductwork that's been shoved up here to provide ventilation. And then again, you can see the cellulose, which here is blown in so tight that there's no ventilation through the eaves. Running ductwork in the unconditioned space, right? You're running your air conditioning air in the attic in the summer that gets to 150 degrees is not great design, but it happens. This is another attic shot, and you can see the tinfoil insulation that's been pulled out and the some blown in cellulose. This is a flat roof model that's having a total redo, and you can see all the remnants of this was probably 3-inch fiberglass insulation was stapled to the ceiling, or stapled between the joists before the drywall went up. So basically the ceiling's attached to the bottom of the rafters and the roof deck's attached to the top. And there's a little insulation in between and that's it. What I want to show here is there's a hole, this is the outside band board. There's a hole drilled in every one of those band boards for ventilation of that little space between the ceiling and the roof. And the problem is that all those life activities that create moisture, the moisture migrates up into the ceiling. In the winter, when that plywood roof deck is cold and the moisture hits it, what happens? It condenses. So you've got this layer of condensation on the bottom of the plywood for 3 or 4 months at a time. So the roof basically is rotting from the inside out. And there's more than one of these roofs that I've walked across and fell through because the plywood was just total mush and feet go through. So the reason these vents exist was to try to get that air out, but the vents are too small, and if you look here, this isn't a great picture, but the header has no holes in it, so there's no cross ventilation, or there's skylight wells, or there's a fan, or there's something else that blocks the actual ventilation from one side of the house to the other, so it doesn't work. So in this model, the flat roof model, that rotting of the roof from the inside out is a big problem. Let's go to the next one. So Michael mentioned the brick a little bit, and yes, the rumor is it all came from warehouses in the Baltimore district. So this size brick was stopped being made in the 20s. So these bricks were probably 100 years old already when they went into Hollin Hills, so they're pretty old. And there's a whole range of different bricks. If you see, there's like dark bricks, and then there's lighter orange bricks, which are called salmon bricks for obvious reasons. And so the reason that it's like this is when they fired these bricks in the kiln in the 150 years ago or 200 years ago, they just stacked the bricks up in this big kiln, and then they built a big fire in the middle. The bricks that were close to the fire cooked darker and harder. The bricks that were on the outside didn't get cooked as much, and so they're much softer. When water gets into these bricks from rain in the winter, the water soaks in, the water freezes, that expanding of the ice pushes off a layer of the surface layer. So it keeps pushing off, and the longer it pushes off, the deeper it gets. So you can see all of the salmon bricks are spalling, or starting to spall, and these darker bricks are not. So when they were originally used, the masons knew the dark bricks were for exterior use and the salmon bricks were for interior walls or where they wouldn't get to the weather. But when Hollin Hills was built, for the architectural value of the color, that sort of common sense was thrown to the wind. This is a chimney. This is another common problem. The water gets through the top cap of the chimney. And again, expansion from ice, from freezing water, forces the joints apart. And so it's super typical, and we've repaired hundreds of these probably. And Hollin Hills is the top 3, 4, maybe 10 courses are just coming apart and need to be rebuilt, repaired. And this is just another picture of the top cap, and you can see it's not waterproof and the water's getting in and the bricks are rotting.
What's the problem with those, with that coursing again?
With which?
The problem, you said the top 10 layers come apart.
This is water getting in and expanding when it freezes, and it forces the
Coming
joints
down
apart.
from the top.
And so the bricks are no longer, there's nothing holding them together. Basically, they're just stacked there, and it's a gravity bond.
Are you also sealing any of the bricks since there are also interior bricks on the outside?
Excellent question. And so the answer is no, and I've seen the bricks sealed by others many times, and because the bricks are so porous and the cracked joints let water in,
Yeah.
that the water's getting in anyway, or it's coming in through the cap, and it just pushes the sealant off as it evaporates out. And usually it changes the color of the bricks. And so my goal is to keep the water out of the bricks, not seal it into the bricks.
But if you were making a repair, if you're regrouting, doing the cap, and like full thing before you take it down to the roof line and rebuild, would you seal then after you've known that you know what I'm saying? Like if you were going for gold before full tear down?
So my sense is that if you do it right, you don't need to seal the bricks.
Okay.
And that's a stopgap that is not necessarily useful.
Robert's got about 10 slides, so as you go through the slides, let's hold the questions, and then we can get Michael and Robert together having a conversation.
So this is just an example of another chimney where the cap has collapsed. And the main thing I wanted to show you is that the chimneys are hollow. They're just big, hollow brick structures. And the brickwork on the inside is not great. You can see it's deteriorating on the inside as well from the water infiltration. And when the water forces the bricks apart, you can basically just lift the bricks out and lift the mortar off. There's no bond anymore at all. So the bricks are only 1 wide thick. And so when you think about it, the chimney mast, when it's on the exterior, is a giant heat exchanger between the indoor temperature and the outdoor temperature. Because it's just this big brick mass with no insulation in it except the air inside. So the chimneys are big heat loss. So the flat roof houses, my main complaint is not that the roof is flat, but is that there's no roof overhang. Builders have learned over the millennia that you need an overhang to keep the exterior envelope of the house from getting wet every time it rains. But Goodman did not believe in that. So you've got this 1-inch overhang, which doesn't even overhang the window trim. So every time it rains, the exterior envelope gets wet. And woodwork is not designed to be wet all the time or every time it rains. And this is what happens. So unless you're out there, so here's the caulking has dried up and cracked, and the water's getting behind the trim, and you can see these little maple trees are starting to grow. So that's an example. If you're not out there caulking and painting basically on a yearly basis, you end up with situations like this, where the water infiltrates the wood and starts to rot, and by the time you notice it, you've got a big problem. All right, moving on. So same issue with the siding. So there are basically 2 main types of siding, well really 3. Clapboard, there's a lot of clapboard siding, I don't know if you're that. The original houses had this kind of siding. This is 1x4 tongue and groove Douglas fir, fairly rot resistant. The problem is at the bottom, in a lot of places they sat the siding on a piece of metal flashing, which in theory sounds good, but the problem is the water gets, and again, there's no roof overhang, water running down this wall enters all the cracks of the joints between the boards, and it sits right down in here, and it starts rotting the wood from the bottom up. And you can see, this was patched at one point, probably because there's a leak in the roof up here, or a leak in the gutter. They patched it, but they didn't fix the leak, so it's continued to rot over time. Most of the houses in the older part of the neighborhood actually have a roof overhang, so that this is not such a common issue. But the houses that don't have an overhang in the newer part, and they have a lot of this T111 siding, this is a very common problem. T111 has gone through 3 permutations of style over time. This is the current version where it's very rough and the grooves are kind of wide. This is an intermediate version where it's a little smoother, and the original siding is very smooth with very sharp square grooves. So you can tell that this is not original siding, this has been replaced. And again, what happens is they put the siding in, and the water sits on this bottom lip, and it wicks up through the end grain of the siding, and it rots it out. And this can happen in 3 years if it's not done right. So when we put in the siding, when we replace this, we prime and paint the heck out of that bottom edge to make it waterproof, and then we hold it up about 3/8 of an inch, so it's never sitting in a puddle of water, so that it's less likely to rot. And we use pressure treated material. But, okay, so we talked about windows, or Michael talked about windows, and he hit on the main issues. This is my house. When we bought this house, it was all single pane glass. So the previous owner had lived with it for 40 years or 50 years. The first winter, when it got cold, these windows were just covered with condensation. You couldn't see through them. It was like frosted glass. Then it got really cold at night, that layer of condensation froze. So I've got a layer of ice as my wall covering, right, on the inside surface. So I call that the Dr. Zhivago effect. If you remember that scene where they're in the boxcar going across the step and there's this wall of ice. Anyway, then the sun comes out in the morning, what happens? The ice melts and there's this waterfall down. So the first thing we did, not the first thing, the first year we replaced basically all the glass. So is it cost effective? Absolutely not. It would take you 1,000 years probably to recoup the cost of replacing the glass. And by that time you would have had to replace it 10 more times or 100 more times. So it's a comfort issue. And it also, the constant wet on the windowsills rots out the windowsills. So lots of people have rotting windowsills, not from exterior leaks, but from the condensation running down and rotting the windowsills. So making sure that the windows are, most people change the windows for comfort rather than for financial reasons. So this is what an insulated glass window looks like from the inside, and this is black spacer. You can also get the basically stainless steel color. And this is what it looks like from the outside. And you notice it's well caulked, well painted, so the water is not getting in behind there. We use, for this exterior trim, we use a mineral-based material that doesn't rot, and it holds paint really well. But if the water gets behind it, it's still gonna rot the wooden frame that's behind the trim. So you've still gotta be diligent about the maintenance. And this is a cross-section or a cutaway of a window, an insulated window. So these are the 2 panes of glass. And this is the stainless steel spacer. And the spacer is hollow, and it has desiccant in it that's supposed to absorb any moisture that gets in between the panes of glass. And there's a little black seal between each glass pane and the spacer. And then the whole thing is sealed with lots more sealant in a hope of making this thing airtight for many years. And generally, the space between the panes is filled with argon gas, which provides greater insulative value than just air. Whether it's really there or not, I don't know how to determine, but I'm paying for it. Something else I wanted to say about that, but I forgot. So there's basically 2 kinds of windows, right? There's the fixed glass that doesn't move, it's just glass. And then there's windows that open, the operating windows. Originally, the operators were metal, either steel or aluminum sliders. And the problem with the metal, besides that it is very conductive, so it's not a good insulator, is that it never really gets a good air seal. It was this metal on metal, or years worth of paint on top of years worth of paint. So not only is the heat, cold air or warm air blowing through the cracks, but it's also conducting through the frame itself. So getting rid of the original operating windows, unless you're a super purist, like, can I mention John Burns, who sent his original steel casements to an auto body shop to be, or somewhere, some specialist, to sandblast and powder coat, and they look beautiful. But most people don't want to go to that level of effort. So most of the major window manufacturers will custom make the windows, the new operating windows, to fit the sizes you need, because they're not standard, and mostly they're all different. But Anderson, Pella, Marvin, they all make these windows that are vinyl wrapped wood windows, and they are fairly solid. So getting away from windows to what's underground. So all of the houses have a concrete slab. If it's a one-level house, that's the entire floor. If it's a two-level house, it's the lower floor. So the concrete slab is basically 4 inches, 3 to 4 inches of concrete. If you're lucky, maybe 2. There's some wire mesh in it. There's a layer of plastic. Then there's a layer of gravel, and then there's the dirt that the house was built on. And so under the slab, there's a variety of exciting features. This is cast iron sewer lines. So all the sewer lines under the house itself are cast iron. This is somebody's kitchen, by the way. So sewer line rusts through. It's underground. You can see where it's leaking out there. So we had to bust through the kitchen floor, dig it out, replace the sewer there. This concrete pipe, as Michael mentioned, is ductwork. There's ductwork under the slab of a lot of the slab on grade houses. It's cement. Concrete, whether it has asbestos or not, is debatable. Some people have had it tested. Some people prefer not to think about it. If it worries you, you need to get it tested. They're just 3 or 4 foot long sections bumped together and sealed with mortar. So it's a very rigid system. So as soon as anything settles, it cracks. And then it's no longer airtight. And so when the furnace goes on, it pressurizes basically the entire area under the slab. And so where you have holes in the slab, like where the bathtub is, you can feel the air blowing out. In the winter, if the perimeter wall has cracks in it, you can see exactly where the cracks are, because the hot air blowing out through the cracks melts the snow. So you're heating the out of doors.
This is depressing.
I'm not done.
Running out of time.
I don't think I can handle another word.
Let's go back anyway. Anybody?
Oh, I think so.
What the hell did we buy, right?
So the pipes under, sewer pipes under the house are vulnerable to root intrusion. This is someone's bathroom floor we busted up, and these are the roots that followed the moisture into the crack and into the pipes. This is the water main, copper water main, iron pipe, iron support post here. Those of you that know your chemistry know that iron and copper should never be touching together because of galvanic action. And you can see that this water main is starting to degrade right here. So eventually that's going to start leaking and causing a flood in the house. Okay, next. This is another kind of sewer pipe. This is cement asbestos. You can see the little asbestos fibers. So it's underground, it shouldn't be a problem. But again, it's full of roots because there's a crack in it somewhere. The roots like moisture that go in there. This is Orangeburg, which is famous in Hollin HIlls. It's another variety of sewer pipe. It wasn't designed to be a sewer pipe. It's basically layers of paper and tar. And it just squishes fairly flat, which is not great for a sewer. This is the water main, which was run right next to the sewer in the same trench. So if you need to find your sewer, look for where your water main shut off is. And then this is the replacement PVC. sewer pipe. So there's 3 different kinds of sewer material there. Let's go next picture, quick. Marine clay. Expansive clay gets wet, it expands. When it dries out, it shrinks. So in the summer, when the trees are sucking all the water out of the soil, the clay shrinks, the house settles at one corner where that tree is. Suddenly the front door doesn't open or close, or the cracks start forming from the window edges. Then it rains and it comes back and you're happy. And then it keeps raining and now a different door won't open or close. Unbalanced retaining walls. Again, either they just weren't engineered properly or the marine clay is pushing them over. So we put in these anchors that there's a threaded rod that goes back 10 or 12 feet to a big concrete anchor. That keeps the wall from coming over more, but it's hard to get it back. This is my basement when I bought the house. So that marine clay is pushing the basement wall in. You can see the curve there. There's about 3 inches from here to here in terms of how much that wall's bellying in. And so we had to do extensive renovation of the basement. Next slide. So just some other things you should think about. Almost all the houses have vinyl tile in them, on the floor somewhere. Usually now it's under carpet or pergo or something. 70% chance it contains asbestos. The cutback adhesive, this tar, 100% chance it contains asbestos. Which is fine as long as it's locked up in the matrix of the material. But when you start breaking it up like here, or if you, God forbid, sand it, you're releasing all that asbestos into the area, causing problems. So be mindful of that. And again, all these houses were originally painted, except for a few, before 1970 when lead paint was banned. So there's lead paint issues in a lot of the houses. The good news is that lead paint was more expensive than regular non-lead paint. So it doesn't exist in most of the houses because they did everything as cheaply as possible. So they were buying the cheap paint, not the good paint. But if you have little kids or pregnant mom or babies, lead is a huge issue. You want to find out and get it tested. And they just come in with this X-ray gun and they can tell you exactly what's lead, what's not. So that's it.
Thank you so much to both of you. We're at time, so if you need to leave, you can leave. The benefit is, this is the last session in this building, so we can have a conversation. Yes, in the front row.
Do you have, what do you think about gutters? It looks like you had them on your house, but you know, we have the wide eaves. I mean, some people have them, some people don't. And the second question is, how do you get into the attic? Because there's no hatch inside the house or anything.
So your house has a cathedral ceiling, right? So there is no attic. It's just.
But it has that crawl space though, I would think, no?
Nope.
No,
It's
okay.
just the rafters like the.
Oh, okay.
But it's on a slope instead of flat.
Okay.
And the gutters, so the gutters, a lot of the houses originally did not have gutters. The question is, if the water runs off the roof and hits the ground, is it gonna cause a problem or not?
Yes.
So if it's hitting like a concrete or a patio or something and bounces, and then it's bouncing on the house, then you have an issue. Or if it's the uphill side of the house and all that water that comes off the roof is then soaking into the ground and then through your basement wall into the basement, then you have a problem. But if it's the downhill side of the house and it's just gonna fall away and drain away down the hill, then it's not a problem. So it's a case-by-case basis gutter-wise.
Gary?
Thank you.
For preventative maintenance, is it good to have an exhaust fan in the loft area of the house?
So it depends who you talk to. Ideally, if you have a temperature activated exhaust fan, that means you're using electricity whenever it's hot. So the better solution is to super insulate your attic so you don't have this 150-degree attic radiating temperature or heat into your house all the time. So you don't need the exhaust fan. But the exhaust fan is way cheaper, right, than the insulation. But is it as good? It really needs an energy auditor to figure it out.
Moisture content, buildable moisture, you said.
So, again, it's better to have the proper ventilation in the roof than to have to run the fan. And a lot of people hear that fan vibrating at night when they're trying to sleep. So if the attic has sufficient natural ventilation, you don't need the fan.
Michael?
I used to think that, before your presentation, that we had more than our fair share of Goodman features. I want to thank you for showing us that we're not so bad at all.
Very good. That's just my house.
A siding question. So I think I have the original siding, and we just need to replace a few siding boards, and you can't find the same siding boards. Do they exist?
Yes.
Where?
So with all the consolidation in lumber companies, basically there's one big lumber company now called T.W. Perry in this region.
My contractor went there.
Well, maybe he wasn't asking for the right thing.
Okay.
Because it's really porch flooring.
Yeah, okay.
So it's
okay.
1x4 tongue and groove.
That's what he said, it looks like flooring.
Right, well, it's porch flooring, but it's used for siding.
Yeah, okay, well then another siding question. So I just did a little bit of repainting on one side, and, the boards are tight in some locations, most locations they're pretty tight still, and then they'll be just a little apart, and it doesn't look as good. Is there any benefit to caulking, or is that just gonna create more problems because of the swelling and shrinking?
So depending on how big the gap is, caulking might be wise if it's, bigger than a hair. I wouldn't use anything solid. You want to use something flexible so that it can give with an expansion and contraction. You don't want to use wood fill or epoxy or anything like that, which would just eventually crack out.
So for aesthetics, you're saying it's okay to use it?
I think that would be okay. I mean, it's an endemic problem because wood is a natural material and
Yeah.
so maybe learning to like it is a better option.
Okay,
Yeah, Robert, if I may, Smooth Lumber, you can go to them and they'll actually cut custom-made bit for you.
okay,
It'll cost a setup charge,
yeah,
but from then on, if you ever need more of that specialized,
okay.
you can just have them.
Right, and
It's
we actually
expensive.
do that with the original Hollin HIlls window stock because it's not available anymore. So when Smoot was in business, we had them, run 1,000 feet at a time.
They're no longer in business?
I think they are gone,
Oh, okay.
sadly, yes.
It sounded like, you feel that in recent years, the tar and gravel quality has deteriorated. That tar and gravel from when we moved in almost 45 years ago was for decades kind of considered part of the harmony and conformity of the neighborhood. Are you kind of vacillating now? And I mean, a lot of people have gone away from tar and gravel and moved towards shingle or
So-
flat roof areas with membrane. Is that kind of where you're sensing? things
Well,
are
the
going?
question is it an aesthetic question or a practical question?
Yeah.
Because the aesthetics depends on who you are. John would never agree with
Yeah,
me
right,
that you should
right.
have a TPO roof or a shingle roof. And frankly, I agree. If you can see it, the gravel looks better. It's in harmony and conformity
Right,
with
right.
the neighborhood. But if you can't see it, I would go with the TPO every time.
Barbara?
On the design, just to comment, when I used to be on the design review committee, we found that there was a big issue with the, getting the tar and gravel roofs because not that many people want to do them anymore. I mean, for years, the whole neighborhood relied on Mr. Jenkins. And, he's gone to his roofing reward. Getting a couple of the companies that did it will not do it anymore. One set fire to their tar truck a couple of years ago, and that really told them they didn't want to do it anymore. So it's becoming more difficult to get somebody who's really competent in there to do it. And it's an issue that the design review committee is having to look at more and more because people are coming to us with all kinds of strange things they want to put on their roof. And we're gonna have to face as a community how to rethink what we want people to be putting on their roofs. Even when it comes to shingles, just getting the plain gray shingle, people say to you,
many challenges.
But Michael's still selling houses, so.
Yeah, I mean, even though, you know, when I go through, I mean, I tell people, you know, I kind of, I mean, it's just the way I am, I go through and say, these are all, this is not necessarily easy to buy one of these. You know, it's like, it takes a lot of work, a lot of effort, especially if you're in Hollin HIlls, you know, in terms of that review, in terms of keeping harmony with the community. So I actually challenge clients in a way where it's like, do you really want to do this? Like, we go look at other houses, do you really want to buy one of these? Because, you know, looking at what Robert put up, I mean, looking at all these things, like, that's what you have to deal with. So I definitely, I know, in my business, I communicate that I'm very blunt, and have been blunt over the years where, you know, making that case to say, you know, now's the time not to buy it if you don't want to, because these are challenges that people have to face.
To Barbara's point about roofing, won't mention any names, but we're aware of a family that recently moved and literally mentioned one of the reasons they were moving was a neighbor across the street, Robert, had put in whatever that very white roofing
TPO.
material is.
TPO.
And they were sitting in their house with this glare constantly.
Super white.
It drove them crazy. But, you know, it's almost a DRC question that,
Yes, yes.
you know, maybe you had to deal with it, but I mean, they told us anecdotally that it really bothered them because of that reflective quality, some of those materials.
Yes, if you have to look at it, it can be.
It comes in new colors now,
Oh.
there's more colors. So
There's some
you
off
get the dark
whites
gray.
that are less.
Okay.
There are a couple of questions in the back, we have time for maybe 2 or 3, Mr. Pierce, too.
Yeah, I would ask about solar panel roofing. Is that allowed in Hollin HIlls, and does it make sense?
Do you want to touch solar panels?
I've been thinking about it. Fairfax County I got a letter from Fairfax County saying they've assembled a list of contractors, if you're interested. The problem, what has stopped me is 2 things. One is we got all these trees, right? So there's not a lot of solar, activity on the roof. And the other is, you gotta fix the roof, you gotta have a brand new roof, I think, before you put on the solar panels, because you don't wanna tear out the solar panels in 5 years to replace the roof. So it's not just the cost of the panels, it's the cost of the roof.
Gary, there's a question.
I was
I just want to comment on this, on what you
gonna
said.
just say something about that solar.
About the roof, yeah, the solar panel, just a point of information, they cannot put solar panels on tar gravel.
Aha, oh, is that right?
Not on anyone because of a guarantee for the roof for 50 years.
No, I mean, one of the things from an aesthetic point of view and real estate point of view, one is like, how does it look? I mean, I see so many houses that it just looks, you know, from an aesthetic point of view, it looks horrible. I looked at I have multiple electric cars, and I looked for that, and I just like, I couldn't do it on my house, and I have like a side gable roof. My house is like from 56 mid-century split, and I just couldn't do it because I just didn't want to look at the panels. Like, it would make sense for me to do it, but I just like actually can't get over the look of it. So that's one. And then just from, you know, just from a real estate point of view, it's just also, you know, you always have to look at, are you leasing them? Did you buy them? Did you pay for them? And how that translates in the transaction, because that's, you know, become a thing. So just, that's something to think about for the real estate.
Question in the back.
I'd like to ask just something that hasn't come up yet, which I think is really an issue, and I see it a lot in Homes Run Acres, the Saturday and Netflix neighborhood, is that the building codes have changed over time, and the insulating value on cathedral ceiling spaces has increased. And so a lot of times roofers, unawares really of aesthetics, especially on mid-century houses, they'll come in and they'll slap on, 4 to 5 inches of rigid insulation on the top side of the deck, and you've gone from beautiful thin eaves that are no more than 6 inches in profile now to eaves that are, monstrous in some cases. And the original details in Homes Run called for tapered insulation at the edge of the roof, but roofers don't like it because it requires more effort, and that tapered insulation is more expensive than regular slab rigid insulation. So my question is, are you seeing that problem in Hollin HIlls, and how are you addressing it? And also, are you seeing any modified bitumen peel and stick roofs, because that is really considered the next evolution of the 30-year built-up roof technology. Modified bitumen peel and stick roofing.
So, two different questions. The tapered edge is a big problem, and there's a house, and a giant addition going up in Hollin Hills right now, and the roof is this thick, and it totally looks horrible, and how that got through the DRC and I have no idea. But anyway, and this happens all the time. The roofers come in and they build up the edge of the roof, or particularly on the flat roof houses, they want to make it drain to the center drain, so the edge of the roof ends up being 18 inches thick. It looks horrible, but it happens. So that's a DRC enforcement issue. In terms of the modified bit, we see people using that more for sheds and other structures, but not so much on the house itself. I think if people are going to a membrane, they're usually going, at least in Hollin Hills, it's either shingles or TPO are the big replacement choices, even though they don't maintain that aesthetic harmony the way the modified bit's a little closer to the gravel. My question?
I just had one question, going back to some of your discussion about attic spaces and insulation. You talked a lot about really good venting, but you kind of alluded to, and I wasn't sure if you meant this, sort of like a fully insulated envelope of some kind. Like, have you seen someone do that? Is that something you are suggesting? Like,
yes, I'm suggesting it emphatically. Thank you for asking. And no one does it because it means ripping down the ceiling in the entire house or the entire upper level. But the thing to do, the way to do it right, is to rip down the ceiling, get all the wiring straightened out, all the other pipes, and then go in there and spray foam on the underside of the roof. So that you have this super insulated roof deck, and the attic is now part of the conditioned space rather than being outside. The alternative that some people are doing, particularly on the flat roofs, as this lady mentioned, is putting panels of insulation on top of the roof deck, which at least keeps the roof deck warm enough in the winter that you don't have the condensation problem. So, but how well that's really gonna work over time is, I think, remains to be seen.
You raised a really good point when you showed that attic image, because that's a cold attic space.
Right.
It's meant to be ventilated, so,
Yep.
so you have to be really careful with adding insulation to the top side of a roof that is currently a cold attic space, because you will get condensation collecting at the top of the space, just because it has nowhere to go.
Right.
So that's important. Jack?
For the in-slab ductwork that you talked about earlier, and I think there was a mention of asbestos, is there a way to, are there people that test for that? Or
Yes, there
companies?
are environmental testing companies that will come out and test your ductwork.
Okay.
And they'll test your lead, and they'll test your water, and whatever you want.
can I ask a follow-up question about that?
Yes.
I know that there's a product that some people use, I think it's called duct armor, and it's some sort of like heavy spray that people use inside of the ducts that are in the slab. Have you had any experience with that, or like,
So
have
there
you
was a
seen
company
it
that
over
was-
time? Like,
There was a company that was making the rounds in Hollin Hills a few years ago, and basically they pull a sprayer through the ductwork, and it sprays a coating of latex goo on the inside of the ducts. And if you're worried about asbestos, that's fine, or moisture migrating through the pipes, that's fine. But when the duct sections are actually displaced, it's not gonna do any good, because you have a crack that's a ½ inch or an inch or 2 inches. So that's a stopgap measure, but whether it's really worth doing. So a lot of people have just abandoned the underslab ductwork and either put in mini splits or figured out how to put ductwork elsewhere. And the other problem with the underslab ductwork, as Michael mentioned, is if your drainage isn't good, the water table comes up and your ductwork fills up with water. So the furnace goes on, suddenly you hear all this bubbling and chugging, and whatever air manages to come out of the ducts is super humid, right? It's been pumped through this water system. So your house fills up with moisture, so it's not a great solution. So that usually means exterior drainage of some sort, sump pumps, gravity drain, depending, or regrading the yard. We've done all those things, and it works. But you know, if you have patios and decks and all those things, suddenly it becomes quite expensive to solve that problem.
So we've hit the witching hour because we pushed by 15 minutes. Robert and Michael will be around if you want to ask questions. Remember your credits. If you head to the Severide House, there's a shuttle if you need it and don't want to walk up